So, what have we done as a service? Well, we've obviously 50% reduction demand in our service is significant. So what have we been doing with that spare capacity, you may ask? Well, we've put a lot of energy and resource upstream. We have a community safety department. The fire service is predicated now on a three-legged stool. It used to be a one-legged stool, response. The three-legged stool is prevention, protection, and response. Now, prevention is, we know what that is. That's about putting some money upstream to prevent something from happening a bit further downstream. And not only do you stop somebody from harm, from being harmed, you also save that money being spent in the future. That's really significant from my perspective. So protection is about making sure buildings are safe. And I think we've seen a stark example just recently, what happens if a building isn't safe. And the last one is, if the other two fail, then we respond. I actually think we should be on a four-legged stool. I'd like to grow another leg. And that would be community resilience, because I think we can make a big difference from a community resilience perspective as well. Some of the examples I can give you in terms of our own diversification and the way that we are working collaboratively, innovatively, collectively, using collective leadership. Co-responder stations. We have 24 co-responder stations within Mid and West Wales. This is where our firefighters, who live and work within 4 minutes of a station, they actually provide medical response as well as fire response. And that medical response is for Category 1 calls or Category A calls, whatever you want to call them, which are life-threatening injuries where somebody is in need of help. But with our footprint of 58 stations, we're able to provide that help within 8 to 10 minutes, which is fantastic. So it's using our geography, our resources and our infrastructure to assist the ambulance service in the provision of their services. 24 stations very soon. We've also got defibrillators and all frontline appliances. Again, we provide medical response from that perspective. Our medical calls are set to be around 4,000 calls this year, out of 14,000, so it's quite significant and will grow, probably grow significantly over this next few years. We have a number of co-location premises where we co-locate with the ambulance service. We have ambulances on fire stations. We also have the court service operating out of Llangollen, Wales. So we have a joint police station, fire station, and court service. There is the magistrates' court is within the building as well. We also provide provision of mast locations for various bodies, including the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. We also have pollution monitoring equipment on our fire stations. We also have mountain rescue teams on our fire stations. We're also looking at the offering of different facilities. So if a local authority is considering closing a library, why can't we have a library on a fire station? Why would we not do that? Because the people who are most likely to use that library are our target audiences. Why would we not do that? Why would we not consider doing that from a co-location and a co-production perspective? We're also looking at joint workshops facilities where ourselves, our ambulance service, police, and anyone else that wants to join, if you like, are able to maintain and service their vehicles in a joint facility. From a co-production perspective, we have a safe, well and independent living initiative, which is ourselves, the health board, the ambulance service, and the local authority, where we're actually having a trial of how can we come together as a joint team to make a difference to people's lives. Just to start, really, so from a prevention, integration, collaboration, involvement, and it being long-term, the fire service, it just fits. What we're doing fits. We welcome the legislation. We welcome the legislation because for the very first time we've been invited to the top table to talk about big issues, and we weren't before. We were at practitioner level invited along, and of course we were making a difference from the ground up. For me, I'm absolutely delighted to be sat around the Public Service Board table with my colleagues, actually really thinking about the future and how we can make a difference together from a collaboration, co-production, co-location, cooperation, all the codes you want to think about. with real passion. And I really do think that we can make a difference together. I think I've probably used my 10 minutes and probably beyond. That's probably all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Mick. Mick Crennell. Mewn welediad diddorol iawn I mewn I 20 mlynedd o profiad, 20 years insight into moving from response to prevention. Really valuable examples there and really valuable experience that I think we can all learn a lot from. And that sense of really making every contact count, of the 50% reduction in service, and more particularly the impact on the individual of people who are now, as Mick very cogently put it, who are now here who wouldn't have been otherwise. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thanks very much, Mick, for that insight. Sets us up nicely for our next speaker, Kelechi Nnoaham from Public Health Wales. I'd like to welcome Kelechi, and let's hear of his experience as well. Diolch yn fawr. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning, Beirne. You can tell from the way I pronounce that Beirne that I'm still trying to get to grips with the Welsh language. And in many ways, I feel a bit like an impostor being here this morning. This is my 9th month in Wales, so I'm still trying very much to understand the system and learn as much as I can learn. I have been here 9 months, and I'm part of the ComTAF University Health Board team, and it's a wonderful privilege to be part of ComTAF and more broadly to be part of Wales. It's been very exciting for me that this morning we're talking about, in many ways, something that was very, very much crucial to my decision to come to Wales. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was a major attractant in many ways for me when I was thinking about taking on the role as Director of Public Health in ComTAF. So in many ways, it's poignant that we're talking about, this is the focus of this conversation this morning. There were 3 things that I was asked to reflect on. And I do have to say it's very uncomfortable talking about myself because I was asked to reflect on my leadership journey. It is very uncomfortable. So as much as possible, I'll start with myself and move it on very quickly. There were 3 things I was asked to reflect on. The first one was on the key stages in my life and my career that affected my mindset when it comes to leadership. And then my experience and leadership skills as they pertain to the remit of the PSB. And if I have any leadership insights, I don't know if I have any leadership insights, but I have learned a few things along the way, and I'll just reflect on them. I think it's impossible for me to think about or to reflect on key stages in my life and career without having my mind cast back to a number of years ago, growing up in a family of 8 in one of the most densely populated cities in West Africa, in Nigeria, in Lagos State, which is projected to be the 3rd largest city in the world by 2030. We were a family of 8, and we had 2 other cousins growing up with us in a 3-bedroom apartment. So you can imagine what life was like on a daily basis. The structure of our family growing up was that I was of the 8 children, I was smack bang in the middle as the 4th child. And growing up in a typical African family, the eldest have a voice. The youngest have a voice. The oldest have a voice because in traditional Africa, you defer to the elder. And the youngest have a voice because they are deemed to be vulnerable. And when you're smack bang in the middle, you don't have a voice. So as the 4th child growing up in a typical African family, I realized that my older siblings and the younger ones could get things that I couldn't get. I didn't have a voice. Now, I know psychologists have done a lot of research to debunk the middle child syndrome. And I don't think I grew up with the anger and the annoyance of a middle child, but I think it made me realize that as I was growing up, I became a very effective negotiator. I didn't have access to my parents big time, and that was real. My siblings did. So I found a way of having access to the resources I refer to as the family's commonwealth. The resources that my siblings had immediate access to, I could get access to those resources and perhaps much more by negotiating with them. So very quickly, I think I learned how to negotiate. More than the negotiation, what I realized was that I grew up with a burning passion to speak up for people who I perceived not to have a voice. And in many ways, that affected my journey going forward. I went to secondary school, and at a very early age, at the age of 15, I was thrust into leadership because the currency in the context I was growing up then in secondary school, I don't know if it is still the same here, is that if you were deemed to be academically strong, you were thrust into leadership, irrespective of whether you had natural leadership abilities or not. So I think I was thrust into leadership, irrespective of whatever natural leadership abilities I had, because I was deemed to be to have strong academic performance. But I think what it meant was that as a senior prefect of a very large secondary school, from the age of 14, I became a senior prefect. Every morning I had to stand in front of the assembly to make an impromptu speech to the body of students, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So I learned very quickly to think about what to say on my feet. I think over years I may have lost it, so I'm struggling with what to say this morning. But I think when I was 15, it came very, very easily. I went to medical school in 1992. It was my first year in medical school. And my training in medicine was very interesting because as a medical doctor, you're trained to develop an expertise. And your leadership, if you go into leadership as a medical doctor, your leadership is based on the fact that you're a technical expert in a field. And you will see as I go on how that was a very, very important moment in my life because 3 years into clinical practice, I realized that my desire to speak for those who I perceived not to have a voice created within me a very, very deep sense of, I'm happy to use the word hatred for injustice and unfairness. And whenever I perceived anything like inequalities that was down to unfairness, it mattered significantly to me. So 3 years into clinical practice, I would see that, hey, this lady that is in my clinical room, she may have a medical problem, but actually her medical problem is not just a medical problem. It is down to the structural inequalities that affect her access to the commonwealth of society. And I couldn't get my mind past those things. And so very quickly, I made the decision that I was not going to do clinical practice anymore. I wanted to go into public health because for me, public health gave me the opportunity to speak for those that I perceived not to have a voice. It was my natural connection to growing up. So I made the transition from medicine to public health. And as time has gone on, I've made the transition from being in public health to being a public servant. And for me, that's an important transition because in public health, you still have to depend a little bit on your expertise. But as a public servant, I've realized that actually it's not about my expertise. My leadership and my credibility as an individual, as a person, it's not based on my technical expertise. It's based on my ability to bring out the best in those around me. And that, for me, was a very, very interesting transition. So in terms of experiences and leadership skills, there are 3 things I just wanted to reflect on. So that thing about being voiceless with those who were the constituted authority, in that case, my parents, but actually having a voice with those who were deemed not to be the constituted authority, affected how I approach. I was just having a conversation with Sheila, who I just met, and we're talking about the strategy around population health that we're developing in ComTAF, and the experience of doing that, being very much around my 7-hour journey into that the chair of our health board did for me when I joined ComTAF. We did a 7-hour journey into the Welsh valleys, just visiting and just seeing, because the first contact as a public health expert that you have with a community is based on statistics. Before I started in my role in November. I had read all the IMTPs, I understood all the statistics, I could reel out all the statistics about ComTAF. But actually, you can know all of the statistics, but what you don't understand is the lived experiences of people on the ground. And the statistics, so the statistics, damn lies on statistics, no. But actually, just having a real understanding of people's lived experience gives a very, very different context from what the statistics would give. So that ability to connect with communities, and for me, it's not just an ability, it's more of a passion, it's more of a desire. Whether I have developed the ability or not, I don't know, but I know it's a driving desire for me. Whatever I want to do, I really want to connect with communities. And I think that leadership from an early age taught me the importance of building relationships and building trust. And I really want to dwell on this for a moment, because there's a quote that I read this in a book, and the first time I used it, somebody attributed it to me, and I said, I read it in a book. I can't quite remember the book I read it. That organizations work at the speed of trust. It's not my quotes, but we've got to build relationships, we've got to build trust, and how quickly we go as an organization or as a system depends actually on how quickly and how effectively we're able to build relationships that are based on trust. And I think in the PSBs, that's absolutely important, where representatives of organizations coming together to work together for the collective good of a system. And our ability to make a difference to the lived experiences of the people for whose reason, in a sense, we're coming together, depends on how able we are to build a relationship that is built on mutual trust and mutual connection. And for me, that's really important. And as a medical doctor, I was trained to have an answer. Moving on from clinical medicine and being a public servant, I've learned how not to have an answer. And that's really important. Because when a patient sits in front of me as a doctor, they've come for an answer. But when I'm talking about obesity, how comfortable can I be to say that I really don't know the answer to obesity? Actually, because obesity is not as simple as having a headache. When I was practicing clinical medicine in Africa, if a patient came with malaria and fever, they used to tell us in medical school that if you hear hoofbeats in the distance, think first of horses and not zebras, except, of course, you're in the zoo. And what they were trying to say to us is that you're practicing in Africa, if you see malaria, if you see fever and headache, think first of malaria and not some complicated, diagnosis. So I think about it and I say, this patient has come to get an answer from me. But actually, when I think about obesity is a much more difficult, intractable, typical wicked problem that does not lend itself to the expert's opinion. And the only solution is based within a system. And for me, that is a very, very interesting mindset, making the transition from a mindset of leadership that is based on my credibility as a technical expert to my credibility as somebody who does not necessarily have all of the right answers, but somebody who is able to ask the right questions. That, for me, is a very, very important transition. And so I'm not going to, suggest many massive insights, but there are two things I wanted to leave. There's a quote here I took from a guy called John Keats, whom some of you may know better than me, but he made a very interesting statement about William Shakespeare, and he said, I quote him, he said, I mean negative capability. That is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after the fact and reason. And so for us in the PSBs, the only one insight that I've gained is the need to remain in negative capability. Because negative capability says, I haven't come as an expert with the answers. I haven't come as an expert with the solutions that I want to prefer. I've come as someone who has a number of questions. And if I ask the right questions, then I have the capability or the opportunity to help the system move forward on the issues. But in negative capability, I'm inquiring, I have my doubts, I'm not suggesting solutions that will solve the problem. I'm trying to understand what's going on in the Welsh valleys. I've asked a number of questions. People tell me about the legacy of mining, and if anyone has asked the question severally about what do we mean by the legacy of the mining, it's me. I've asked severally. Everyone who's told me about the legacy of mining, I've asked, what do you mean by the legacy of mining? And as we begin to peel the layers of the onion off of that, I've had about at least five different perspectives on the legacy of the mining. I'm still in very much in that negative capability space. If anyone has the answer, please tell me. I'm trying to understand it, because I think the legacy of the mining has affected or has a major impact on where we are in the Welsh valleys, and will have a significant impact going forward. So as we think about the well-being of the current generations and the future generation, having an understanding of the impacts of mining and not necessarily the five perspectives on it will be very, very important for me. So one insight I would leave for us as individuals operating in a system space is let us remain in that place of negative capability, because it is only negative capability that we can innovate the solutions that our future generations need. And the last thing I will say is about systems thinking. I grew up thinking for an organization or being part of an organization. But in the PSBs, we will think beyond organizations, beyond the boundaries of our organizations. And it's about what works for the system. But the reality is that very often what works for the organization is not necessarily what works for the system. And I have seen this in the early days of the PSBs, and I think it will be an abiding challenge for us, how as participants in the PSBs, we're able to think about the priorities of our organization, to think about the priorities of the system. The priorities of the system being defined principally by what the people who we're here for need the most. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, Kelechi Nnoaham. And we had some great insights once again from Kelechi, and some terrific messages as well. It was really fascinating to hear where that passion for speaking on for those who are without a voice came from. And some of the sort of key messages that I think we can take forward is that pwysigrwydd deall bywyd am y pobl yn byw, you know, the lived experience of people, and having that at the root of everything. Pwysigrwydd adeiladu perthynas ac ymddiheuriadaeth, the key role of trust and building partnerships. I think there's a real lesson for us there in terms of that core message about learning not to have an answer, and understanding the complicated nature of many of those serious challenges that are facing us, and taking us back to that involving people and working with them, and to mix co-production and collaboration. I think there's a lot of themes coming together here. So on that note, I'd like to hand over now to Kellie Burn from Monmouthshire County Council, our next speaker. Kellie.
Well, that's a really easy job, isn't it, to follow a colleague who's spent how many years giving impromptu speeches 5 days of the week? So thank you. I'm really happy to be here this morning and to give this talk, because as daft as it may sound, we're here to talk about public service. And as I say, you know, that's probably self-evident. We are, after all, talking about public service boards. But I still think public sector is the prevailing term when we seek to describe our work. And we're not, are we? We're here as a public service. You know, it's about what we do and not about who we are. And really, really pleased, because when I was given the brief and I was looking at it last night and scribbling some notes, I thought there was something really life-affirming about the questions that were posed in terms of leadership insights. And, you know, I was scribbling some stuff and I thought this feels a bit self-indulgent to talk about me as a leader. But actually it was a really, really good thing to do, because it made me think about why I get out of bed in the morning, what gives me my purpose, why public service is a vocation. And that was quite a good self-avowing thing to do, I think. So a little bit about my leadership journey, and some of this is going to be a bit contentious, because even though I'm a massive advocate of public service, it's my passion, I think it needs to change. So some of this is contestable, so please feel free if you need to. So my journey then in the context of the well-being of future generations, and again, great question, because I think the question was less about positional power, what positions of leadership have you held, and it was more about mindset. You know, and for me, you know, as a big advocate of public service innovation, I think mindset is everything. It's about your value set. It's about your culture set. And culture is crucial, isn't it? Because culture is what we grow our people in. And I was always taught that you could hire for attitude because you could train for technical ability. That stuff can come. Mindset, attitude, being can-do is the most important thing. So talking about how I was hired then, my entry into public service was accidental. I'd spent a couple of years after leaving university working for Marks & Spencer as part of their graduate training program in Vancouver. And I loved it because I was out on my own, I had no family there, had to think on my feet, had to be really quick-witted, you had to be really commercial, the art of negotiation was everything, you had to have acumen and flair, you had to move really quickly and be quite dynamic to survive in that kind of competitive environment. And resilient, something with which I struggle sometimes, was really, really, really critical. So when I arrived home and I thought, right, okay, I've got to think about my career and what I'm going to do next, I spoke to my mum and some of her friends. They worked for the local council, and it sounded great. There was flexi time, there was loads of leave, there was loads of benefits, you got training paid for. And I thought, wow, this sounds great. Obviously, in addition to the core purpose of public service, which is about creating capable communities and changing people's lives. I got the job, and all of those things were true, really, apart from sometimes the bit about changing people's lives and creating capable communities. The flexi time was great. It was as I was promised. But I thought I was employed because I was probably a bit different. I had a fresher perspective. I would bring, a new vantage point to some of these things. But quite quickly, I felt standardized, if I can use that word. I had a job description, but I was really, really constrained and boxed in by it. I found the culture really risk-averse. I felt like I couldn't bring my whole self to work, the commercial bits about me, the entrepreneurial flair. I was told time and time again, we don't do that in the public sector. We fix people, we provide. We don't throw problems out there for communities to think about. We provide solutions. It was really hierarchical, it was really structuralist, and it was more about, how things were done than what was actually done. So I had ideas, I had suggestions, I had loads and loads of energy in those days. I'm quite old now. But, apart from the occasional tweak, which I was permitted to do under sufferance because it was improvement, I came to see that, this was, if anything, going to be about doing the same old thing slightly better. It wasn't about doing fundamentally better things, which is, very, very different to me. One night, I was tasked with doing what we called a rough sleep account. And I was dispatched into the town centre with a clipboard with a group of others. And our job was to go around counting how many people we saw sleeping rough. And I never forget, sleeping on the station bench, I met this young boy. Michael was his name. He was 16. And he'd been thrown out. He'd come from North Wales. He'd got the train. Terrible, terrible story. And I wanted to help him. I wanted him to come with me. And he was ashamed because he pulled his jumper down and showed me that he had lice crawling all over his body, so he wouldn't come into the hostel. And when I got back to the office that night, I had a story to tell, but they didn't want stories, they wanted numbers. I had a case that this was urgent, it needed to be dealt with. But that wasn't the end game. The end game was submitting a form. It was making that submission. It was all about hitting targets that I felt missed the point, which was really significant for me. And again, I was told, there was no place for going over and above here. That was the task. Why couldn't I just do it? And I think that was the day that I really became a vocational public servant. And that was the day that I decided that I was going to become a leader, because that was the best way in which I could make an impact upon this person's life. So I needed to find my voice. So I went on a bit of a mission, found myself a network. And, don't get me wrong, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying that, people in that organization were all the same, because they weren't. There were some fantastic people, some people who did want to do things better, but they were seen as the happy clappies, and you're one of those, So it was quite a difficult time. And I appreciate this is some time ago, but the question I would ask is, have things changed enough? So yeah, I found a network, I did some research, I became knowledgeable about public service all across the world. I found out what was happening on a much wider scale, Scandinavia, North America, Australia. I was hungry for it. I knew things could change. And I think the lesson I very, very quickly learned was that your vantage point determines much of what you can see. And the question you ask determines the answer, or how much of the answer that you actually get. So fast forward 2010, I got a job at Monmouthshire County Council, working with somebody I'd worked with quite extensively before. So a good leader. And I just wanted to sort of set out what I think good leadership is. You know, I've worked for good people who taught me to have trust and confidence in them as a good leader. I've worked for great people who've taught me to have trust and confidence in me because I'm a great leader, and I think that is the core distinction. So austerity had set in, and we both knew that, you know, to sort of take this organisation on a new journey was going to be an adaptive leadership challenge. And, you know, innovation enterprise was explicit in my role. It wasn't do the technical stuff and throw a bit of this in. You know, this was the day job. This was what the organisation needed to sort of group around. And I was thrown straight into a process with Nesta, Innovation Unit, Bloomberg Philanthropies, organisations like the Wikipedia Foundation, because we were taking part in a programme called Creative Councils, and I loved it. You know, it was able to understand the inflection point that public services were at, and I believe are still at. You know, the need to really create services that were capable of changing lives. And I felt as well that, you know, there was some understanding that in public service very often, you know, the system ingrains failure and self-interest. It just does. And the research and development that I loved so much about the private sector, you know, the rapid prototyping, the adoption, the ideation, mantras like fail fast, fail forward, were alive and well in some parts of the public sector. There was a structured process around which you could do some of this stuff. So really understanding the true nature of the problems that needed to be solved, because we all know big problems require radical solutions, don't they? And it was really about bringing that sense of entrepreneurial leadership to the public space. So I loved this phase in my own sort of personal journey. I didn't feel like a misfit anymore, which I'd often felt over the years. And even though austerity kicked in, you know, there were loads of different ways to frame challenges and opportunities to unlock new solutions and resources. Because I think sometimes in the public service, we are constrained by our knowledge. We're almost cursed by what we know. And I'm really interested in the things that we don't know. You know, the art of the possible, I think, is absolutely essential. So new ends, new means. And I think in my organisation, what I'm blessed, and I hope this impacts upon our public service board and the direction in which we take things, is that, you know, we need to fire things up. We need to create space and permission. It's not about us. It's about the way in which we relate to the world outside of our walls. So for me, there's a new concept of value creation which we have to embrace around public service. And I think it is, you know, public service for public good. So leadership behaviours in a public service board context then. And, you know, the first one reflects something which the Commissioner said this morning. Leadership. And again, that sounds daft, doesn't it? Because it's self-evident. Of course, we need leadership. But I mean leadership as opposed to followership. You know, not can I, but I can. And I've said, you know, before that, you know, the only job of a leader, I think, is to create more leaders. And, you know, as I've said already, it's not about us, is it? It's always about the other in the public service context. And public expectations are changing, so the way in which we do things has to change as well. And I don't know about you, but I found over the years that very often leadership in public service, you know, sometimes it feels a bit traditional, heroic, strong, charismatic, tough. You know, leadership today needs to be more about emotional intelligence, about insights, about leading from behind. You don't have to be, you don't have to be at the front to be at the forefront. So I think this whole dimension around leadership is changing, and that's something, you know, the kindness, the empowerment is something we need to embrace. The second thing I think in a public service board context, and, you know, sometimes a reason why I hear things can't be done is due to resources. You know, this reliance on traditional monetary resources. Well, resources may be going like that, but ideas, social capital, skills, assets, volunteers, they're all going like that. So the key is, how do we unlock those new forms of resources, which I believe hold the answers to some of our biggest questions and our biggest problems? How do we broker those relationships most effectively between the different players in public value? So we can't just eke out minor efficiencies and be grateful with that. You know, that is not the job that we're here collectively to do. And I think, you know, the kinds of radical conversations that we need to have shouldn't allow us to accept conventional answers. The last one really for me is this focus on futures. You know, we talk about the future as if it's, you know, gazing, thinking about flying cars. You know, the future isn't about fixed points of progress. You know, we all know that, otherwise we would be seeing flying cars. So, you know, looking ahead, I think, is really, really important. And my friend, the late, great Martin Rijart, Professor Martin Rijart, who recently passed away, always used to say we have to engage in much more structured forms of anticipating future developments and thinking about their impact, you know, for today, on today, now. So how do we rapidly adapt? How do we have attentiveness to changing conditions at all levels? And the Commissioner used a stat earlier, you know, that World Economic Forum stat about, you know, 2/3 of our young people are not equipped to engage in industries of the future. You know, those jobs haven't yet been created. And as a public service, you know, 1 million of our jobs will be automated, replaced, displaced over the next 5 years. What does that mean for us? And that World Economic Forum report on the future of work says the top 3 skills that we will need over the next 3 years are critical thinking, it's about collaboration with others, and it's about creativity. You know, that is the new sort of toolkit, I think, for a public service worker. So just to conclude then, I mean, I don't have any great leadership insights, and as I say, much of what I've said is contestable. I do believe public service is a great thing, but I believe if it doesn't change, you know, if it can't look ahead, if it can't develop that ability for foresight and to respond quick enough, I think the very relevance, legitimacy and viability of public services could be threatened. So I suppose my insights are implicit in what I've already said. As I say, I'm very passionate about public service, and perhaps I'm guilty of some of these things myself. You know, very often we find ourselves in cultures where we've got to hit the target, you know, miss the point. And colleagues here who are involved in a City Deal project, you know, we know that working with some partners, trying to bring forward a big project in an industry of the future that will have tremendous benefits. You know, sometimes people's objective is not to land on the front page of the Western Mail. You know, there is, you know, inherent problems around the way in which we manage risk. So, you know, sometimes it is easier to stay under the radar. You know, failure by omission, I think, is a big problem. And public service boards can do something about this because we have critical mass, we have strength in numbers. So finally then, for me, brave leadership doesn't sleep at the wheel. The well-being of future generations is a statutory requirement. It didn't need to be, but, you know, I think there are some good lessons for us in terms of where we've been over the past few years and how we can respond better in the future. I just want to touch on risk and failure just very, very quickly. You know, sometimes I feel in the public service, you're damned if you do, but you're not damned if you don't. And we've got to reverse some of those consequences, shift the paradigm. As I say, you can't expect to do the same old things better. We have to do fundamentally better things. Risk does mean confronting our fears and challenges and having the courage to move forward. I think calculated risk is beyond just tolerance of consequences. And for me, that's the key difference between risk and risky behaviour. It's really easy to tread water, isn't it? We all know that. And I think leaders of public services must have the courage to begin. So whilst others wait for safer conditions, better times, a more certain environments, we have to have the courage to begin. Caution and indecision robs us, I believe. And, you know, sometimes that is the most reckless form of behaviour. And lastly, accountability, and I've probably said it already, but I want to be challenged as much for the things that I haven't done as the things that I have done. You know, I think getting that balance right, especially in terms of audit and regulation regimes, is absolutely crucial. So brave leadership of public services, of public service boards, you know, is very much on our agenda. And I think our role as brave leaders in a new era of public service delivery, I just think it means that we have to lead to an almost impossible destination. And impossible because I don't think that destination is in this world. It's in being. I think it's in moving towards our collective better selves. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, Kelly. Thank you very much for that. Again, now, I've been told we've got to all be up here in front of the, between the screens, haven't we? Yeah, okay. So I think perhaps we could go in front.
Thank you to all three of you. That was, we've got a chair. There were some really, really valuable insights there, and all coming from a slightly different perspective, which was incredibly useful. So we've had a number of questions fed in. I'm going to go from the ones that have had the most likes. So the first one, how do we harness enthusiasm from partners and really think about what we're going to do rather than spend PSB time on formal agendas and papers? Need a new approach. It shouldn't just be like all our other committees. Who wants to start off with that one? Kelly? Yeah?
I'm happy to go first. I think, with PSBs, we've just got the opportunity to break the mould. We don't have to sit around tables. They don't have to be in council chambers. There's probably something wrong, actually, if these meetings do take place in very formal council settings. I think we need to get out there and soak it up, understand normatively some of the experiences. And I think, for me, in thinking about some of the progress that we've made locally on some of the biggest issues, is because probably, and at the time, it probably seemed like an inordinate amount of time, we spent time on understanding the nature of the challenge to be addressed. Because I think very often, sorry, am I not loud enough? Very often, it's easy, isn't it, to jump to solutions and thinking that we know best and we'll try this because it's worked before. And I think there's a famous Einstein quote that says, when I'm faced with a problem, I spend sort of 90% of my time understanding it and 10% of the time on the solution. So I think, for me, that's been something that's worked really well and is very important.
Thank you. I think the enthusiasm's already there. I think harnessing it is not necessarily the issue. I think this is just about a paradigm shift. This is about thinking differently. I think what you can be constrained with is the past. Sorry, you can be constrained by the past. And I think we need to unlearn some things. Having an agenda, having it structured, having this, having that, it's just there, it just exists. We need to challenge that. I think that within Swansea and Neath Talbot's public service boards, we very quickly challenged that ourselves. Now, I'm not saying it's not still there, because you do need to have some formality. But what we have done is we've committed to walking each other's shoes for a period of time. So we've actually arranged a number of days where we will actually step off the planet for a little while and go and walk in each other's shoes so that we can learn about each other. I think that enthusiasm is already there. It's just about pointing it in the right direction.
I completely agree with that. I think Kelly, you used the phrase brave leadership. And for me, that brave leadership really is if we all came together in the PSB and we did the same things and did the same things the way we always did them, I don't think anyone would find any enthusiasm there. And I think the real key to enthusiasm is innovation, coming up with a very different way of doing things and different ideas. I, for one, find that my enthusiasm just rises when there's an opportunity to do something new and something different. And I think, like most other people, I think, I find it a lot easier to disengage when the solutions we're preferring are the solutions we preferred 20 years ago, and the way we're doing things today, or proposing to do things, are the ways we did them 20 years ago. So, and I'm particularly excited, and I completely agree, the enthusiasm is already there, because there's a whole lot of fresh, new, creative, innovative ideas that are coming out from different PSBs, and I think the ability to harness that is our challenge. But I don't think it's a major challenge, because it is already there, and there are new ideas that are coming out, and I think that's the best way to sustain and harness that enthusiasm.
Pick up on the next one. How does our approach to risk have to change to deliver the Act effectively? Kelly, you talked about risk a fair bit in what you said. Anything else that you wanted to say?
I think we have to invert that typical perspective that, the risk is in doing, very often the risk is in not doing. And I think for me, it has to be about embracing failure, not in a simplistic way, we'll fail and that's okay. Because, I think every success probably started off as a failure, but I do think there is some technical learning to do around failure and risk. And when you look at the world's biggest public service organisations like DARPA, they reckon the failure rate is about, the success rate is about 1 in 20 rather. You've got to fail 19 times just to pull off a nugget. And, there are systems and processes that we can wrap around that. That's very difficult. And that's where the bravery comes in, because I think in times of austerity, tolerance thresholds for risk and failure are very low, because you will end up on the front page of the paper. So, it brings me back to this need for bold leadership. And I think public service boards with their critical mass, I think, can do a good job of work around this. Fail fast, fail forward.
Yeah, bold leadership is right, I think. Risk, if you think about risk, is prevention is risky, isn't it? Prevention's risky because you're trying to prove a hypothesis. We think this might change if we do this. If you think like that, you're never, ever going to change anything. We have to be brave enough to put that pound upstream to make a difference later on. And sometimes a business case won't provide that for you. That's brave and that's risky, because not only are you risking your reputation, potentially in the media, you're also risking public funds. I don't think we should be afraid of that. I absolutely think we should embrace that, and I absolutely think that we should not be scared of failing. We need to test out hypotheses, absolutely. Of course, don't do it on a grand scale. You do it in little pockets. You do it in little trials here and there. You prove the system. You embrace it, and you make it more enhanced, and then you plant it elsewhere. That's the ethos of prevention, and for me that does take some bravery and some leadership bravery in the outset.
I think I do have to say that I'm a bit less hopeful on the issue of risk than I am on other things, because I've seen this materialize very often. So I find that the last point I was making about organizations having to walk beyond organizational priorities to system priorities. At the end of the day, many of us who represent organizations on system partnerships like PSBs have a fundamental responsibility. Some of those responsibilities are financial, so you've got to return a balanced budget. Now, that weighs heavily on the minds of individuals in the context of their organizations as they come into the system space. And the management of risk, at the end of the day, is a very cultural thing. So I'll give a very specific example of data. In the world where I live, the ideal situation is when we can connect health data, police data, local authority data, and data from other public sector bodies together in order to give us a sense of what difference we're making. But the risk in that is so immense, particularly in the context that we're operating, that when you think about how do we actually bring all of that data together to make a difference, we are often stopped by the risks of getting it wrong. And that is largely cultural. And so the question for us, and I don't have an answer, the question for us is how do we tone down the sense, the cultural sense that limits us, so that we can make progress on some of those issues. Otherwise, I do think that as organizational representatives, the sense of the risks that we're carrying for our organizations potentially limits us in making some really risky decisions in the context of system partnerships. So I do have to say that I'm less hopeful, but that less hopeful means that personally I have not necessarily seen an answer.
Okay, just to remind you, if you still want to submit questions, we're doing what the younger generations are doing now. We've all got our heads on our tablets and phones rather than our voices actually communicating, but that's technology, and that's what's helping us to live stream this and include our colleagues who aren't here in the room with us. If you do want to still submit questions and you haven't logged into Slido, the password is there, #GCW. Hang on, where's my questions gone? There we are. Right, okay. So there's a comment here, refreshing to hear that big issues matter. The long term is valid. We need to build capacity and space to plan for the future on PSBs. I couldn't agree more. There's one specifically for you here, Mick. Mick, can you define community resilience and explain how you would develop it if you had this fourth leg?
Not easily. Ooh. Not easily and not very quickly. Community resilience for me is in times of adversity, when things are tough, all of the public services are stretched. Communities need to be able to and have the capability and the wherewithal to look after themselves at times. So rather than be, it's controversial, chicks in a nest, they're able to have community plans that enable them to survive through a difficult time with the support of public services. And certainly we have a footprint amongst all of us to enable that to happen. I think that there are times where communities turn to us more readily than perhaps we would want them to. And I think with community resilience comes community cohesion as well. And I think that we can make a difference there with the infrastructure that we have. And certainly, I believe that from a fire service perspective, we have that inherent capability to assist with that. Not just assist, but perhaps lead with that.
Thanks, Mick. Okay, we've got time, I think, for maybe one more question. I want to encourage you all, before you leave, to use the video booth to tell us what's going on in your area, what commitment you're going to be making to making the Future Generations Act real, what commitment you're going to make to address some of the kind of leadership challenges that our panel here have raised this morning. So I think this is quite a nice one to end on. What do we need to do around the PSB table to make to better take on the challenge of thinking for the long term, and specifically what can we do at the next PSB meeting? So I think this is a good one for us all to hear some insight on that. What could we be doing at the next meeting? Kelly?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, and I suppose it's linked to the question above, really, about sort of problem-solving skills. I think the problem-solving skills are out there. I think our communities possess them in abundance. I think what we've got to get better at is problem definition, really understanding in a deep way the challenges that we're seeking to respond to. I think, again, there's something as well about, the kind of skills, the experiences, the tools, the techniques that we bring to the table. Do we have that skill set to be 21st century public servants? And I think a great thing to do at a next PSB is to have that challenge, to have that sense of being disruptive, not disruptive for disruptive's sake, because it sounds cool and all the best people are disruptors, but, just to make sure we have a strong sense of challenge and that we are challenging the behaviour that I believe has sometimes led us to the point that we find ourselves at.
Oh, I absolutely support that. You took words right out of my mouth. For me, in an ideal world, the next Public Service Board meeting would be that we throw away the agenda. Yes, we've got things to talk about, we've got business to do, but let's lose the process. I think we've discussed that enough already. But for me, we're a little bit too polite sometimes. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not about having a fight around the table. Absolutely, that's the wrong thing to think about. For me, this is about the challenge. It's about us challenging ourselves and challenging each other in a safe environment. For me, if you don't do that, you're not going to challenge your paradigms. And I think that's something that we clearly need to do at this moment in time.
So I would go agreeing with what Mick and Kelly have said. If we were sitting in our next PSB, I would like to ask the question, where are we with the development of our objectives? Okay? And if we sat down and looked at those objectives and asked ourselves the question, if we had limited resources, which horses would we back? And what is the likelihood that the objectives we're about to agree and the plans we're about to develop behind them will make a blind bit of difference? That, for me, is a question that keeps haunting me personally, because, again, we can do the things that have been done before. We can do them the same way they've been done before, and they can look good in a plan. They can look good in a set of objectives. But the question will be, in the next 5 to 10 years, are we still going to come back and suggest the same things and do the same things? I'm very, very much looking forward to our PSB being really brave and inspired, and I have seen that already, so that's why I'm really hopeful of this, that our PSB will look at the direction we're going and say, you know what, we've never done this before. We're taking a bit of a risk here, but we're confident, relatively confident, that these things that we're proposing will make a difference. So for me, I hope we can use our next PSB to ask ourselves that question of standing back and saying, will any of this make a blind bit of difference?
Thank you, Kelechi. I think that's a really good point to end on, absolutely. And I think what all three of you said there in answer to that last question is absolutely spot on. But particularly the last point, what difference is any of this going to make? Because we can carry on and do the same things that we've always done, and we can get the same results that we've always had. And I think, there is a moment in time now and that kind of legislative permission for us to do things differently. And I think it's up to the leadership that you show as to whether you're going to grasp that moment of opportunity to make that difference for communities now and for the future, or whether we're going to deliver more of the same. So on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming along this morning. We hope that you found it useful. We hope that it's given you some insights on some of the challenges and opportunities that other public sector leaders sitting around PSB tables like yourselves are encountering. We're hoping that the rest of the day will provide some really good learning opportunities for those people in particular who support you around that PSB table to be challenging back to you. And, some of the things we hear is that some of them are frustrated by the leadership. We also hear that some of you are frustrated by the what you're getting from your support. So I'm hoping that we can all be coming together to learn together and to really start making a difference and doing things differently. So thank you very much for coming this morning. Can I please remind you again about the video booth? You probably won't be allowed out unless you've been and said at least something to the video booth. I know Gareth Chapman had promised that he was going to go first. Where is he? He's hiding over there now. So thank you very much, and you can continue to feed in throughout the day on Twitter and so on. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.